2. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to Security Boulevard Roundtable. My name is Cody, and I'd love to welcome you back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting conversation ahead, but before we dive in, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review with you. First of which, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to a recording on demand. Now, as this is kind of a conversation-based roundtable today, we do want your input. And so there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first option for you to engage with us is the chat tab. So feel free to warm that up for us right now by letting us know from where in the world you are joining us. I'm sure we have a global audience, and we want to see just how far our reach is. If you have any specific questions, we do want you to direct those to the Q&A tab. Sending those direct questions to the Q&A tab allows us to keep track of our questions. We want to answer as many as we can and keep them orderly. So just to help us not miss or skip over it, send those into Q&A and we'll address those as we go. Additionally, before we close things out today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around to find out if you're one of our lucky winners. So our topic is identity and access management. And I'm joined today by Matt Chiotti, Chief Trust Officer and Technical Advisor at Serby. Welcoming back Neil Carpenter, Principal Technical Evangelist at Orca Security. And of course, leading our conversation today is our very own Sharon Florentine, Managing Editor at Techstrong Group. So Matt and Neil, thank you both so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. Sharon, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
I would love to. Thank you, Cody. Welcome, Neil and Matt. Great to be here with you today to talk about identity and access management. Yeah, Matt, we're going to get into the Philadelphia, but we're both here in Philadelphia, so we gotta put our heads together on that a little bit later. But yeah, so identity and access management. Over at Security Boulevard, I cannot help but notice the influx of articles and think pieces talking about just all aspects of identity. And one of the things that I constantly see is identity is the new perimeter. So let's kick it off and start talking about what exactly that means and why that's become such a big catchphrase around this topic lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this is I think it's a marketing phrase to some extent, right?
It is that.
and I'd be curious. I want to hear what Neil has to say about this. But from my perspective, identity has always been the perimeter. I don't think that's new. So think about it from a historical perspective, right? If you go back, 10 years ago, you had firewalls at your perimeter. And if you had like a web-based application, right? Most organizations, they typically had a rule in that firewall that said, allow any from on port 80 and 443. And you could come right into the DMZ, access the web server. Okay. So that was not really much security there, blocking all these other ports, but allowing 80 and 443. Where identity always then came in is if there was a sensitive resource that you were trying to access, you were prompted to put in a username and password. A lot of times that would have been just basic authentication, username and password. So for me, I think, identity has always been at the perimeter. And I think this more expresses just a change in a lot of security teams' focus, their budget versus, the actual reality of security. And I think now it's just identity finally getting the focus it deserves. Neil, what do you think?
So, I think to some extent you're right. But I will also say it's a huge, the sort of, the move outside of the office, the move to being much more mobile and work from home, the whole sort of combination of things, plus the cloud arena, for me, fundamentally changes the tenor of how we approach identity. And I'll use a personal example. I spent 20 years at Microsoft, which remains really a very sort of traditional IT organization. In particular, in the late 90s, the early 2000s, it was very much, there was a perimeter, there was a corp net, And what was on the corp net was implicitly trusted. What was outside the perimeter was implicitly untrusted or explicitly untrusted. And I left Microsoft and went to a startup, and went from a world where I knew that there were lots of data centers. I had a desk and desktops, and that's not entirely true. I was completely remote by the time I left, but effectively most people still had desktops and desks and all of these things. And one day in this new world, I realized I had a laptop. We owned a bunch of laptops, and that was really it for the IT infrastructure we had. And not only that, I didn't do all my work on my laptop. I did my work on my personal laptop, on my phone, on my iPad, sort of wherever I was. And I think, as I think about the idea of identity being a perimeter, this is where it really comes to is a lot of times I can take myself, not just, and my CISO will not be happy to hear this, but not just working on my Orca laptop, but I may be doing a lot on my phone. I may be away for the weekend and have an iPad and somebody asks me a question, I'm pulling up some things. What's important about me as part of the bigger picture is no longer the device I'm on and where that device is. It's who I am and how I authenticate to it. So yeah, I think it's not entirely a new concept, but what is new is the move to identity being the first thing we're worried about rather than sort of location or device.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, like you said, Neil, the pandemic really accelerated that trend because no one could be in that one singular location anymore. Everyone was, instantly relegated to outside the perimeter, so to speak. And, that's a good segue into my next question, which, like I just said, like you said earlier, that evolution really got jump started with the pandemic. But what were some of the other driving forces behind that move to identity being such a priority? Was it, the massive number of perimeter breaches? Was it other things that I'm not thinking of? What's really accelerated this movement?
So I work for a cloud security company, so it's what's top of mind for me. But I would say the move to the cloud is one of the big ones, and not just in terms of the same sort of decentralization as we saw in the move away from the office, but identity becomes very different in the cloud as well, for lots of reasons. But it becomes in my mind, it becomes much more complex, and it's tied to everything. So it becomes incredibly important that we get it right. And I was prepping for today. I was reading back through some things written over the last few months, and everybody's citing the same Gartner number. That Gartner expects 75% of compromises to come from sort of poorly configured identity. And 50% of all numbers are made up, but that one rings true for me, right? Like we know if we just look at the way identity is managed, we know that there are tons of problems. In particular around cloud identity, it's so complex that everything is over permissioned, which means as soon as I compromise one identity, it can do far more than it ought to be able to, which makes it for an attacker to move place to place.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a couple other areas too that have kind of led to this whole identity as a new perimeter. If you look back, maybe over the last 5 to 10 years, there's a couple things, right? So one is the number of applications that people have to remember passwords for, right? This is why we have things like password managers today, right? Enterprise password managers. However, even with password managers, I think as Neil was alluding to, we still have like the most recent Verizon data breach report that said 74% of breaches include the human element, whether it's stolen credentials, reused credentials, things like that. So clearly password managers are not enough. So you've got the sheer number of applications. And then you also have another piece that we haven't touched on yet, which is the number of applications that don't support identity standards like single sign-on and SCIM, right? So, typically underneath SSO, you've got protocols like SAML, OIDC, And then on the kind of the provisioning, deprovisioning side, you've got SCIM, this system for cross-identity management. A research that we did, and these are not for the 50% of made up numbers, these are real numbers. Although I do agree with you. I've read some statistics, and I always tell people, whenever you see a stat, go to the back of the report and see the methodology that they used. And if it's not disclosed, just assume that statistics are garbage. They don't disclose the methodology. Anyway, so we found in our research that 61% of the top 10,000 SaaS applications don't support single sign-on. 61%. Most people assume like, hey, I'm getting a SaaS app. It's going to support all the modern standards, but it's not the case. 94% don't support SCIM. So even though this is a protocol that's been around for, I think, probably 15 plus years, it only has, barely 6-7% penetration. So you've got things like that, right? So the evolution to to identity is the new perimeter is because the application landscape itself has changed so radically over the last decade. And Neil's right. A lot of that has been driven by this continual move to the cloud. The pandemic was a big driver of that. And a lot of times people ask me when I bring some of those stats up, they say, well, what do you mean? Like, so there's a chance that if I go and buy a quote unquote modern SaaS app, that it's going to lack these identity standards? And the answer is yes, because the software vendors in many cases are not building to these identity standards because their user base is not asking for it. So that's a big part of it, right? So if you think of like, I'm not going to name a specific app, but if you think of certain marketing applications, right? That user base, they're not asking for certain of these enterprise features. There's a functionality that they want. If the application delivers it and it's efficient, they'll go out, swipe a card, they'll get it, right? Or in some cases, it's not even like shadow IT. It's not even swipe a card. It could be an application that has been provisioned by IT, but it just doesn't support the standards, so they can't manage it at scale. So, that's why we see things like enterprise password managers. They help a little bit, but they lack that automation, and they really don't help businesses leverage their existing investments in identity providers, things like Okta, Azure AD.
And I'll throw out one more while we're at it. And I see somebody mentioned two-factor identification, which is absolutely a powerful tool. But one of the other things we've seen happen over the last 10 years or so is the proliferation of APIs, automation, and non-human machine identities in use. Where, if like when I'm old, to say the least, I think it's fair if I say I've had a career after 20 years at Microsoft. But I was thinking about APIs the other day, and I grew up in a world where an API was something your application used to interface with the operating system. And the last 10 years, that's just no longer the case. APIs are how our applications are talking to each other, and that's an incredibly powerful tool for us to solve problems and do things. But my application can't, check the two-factor. It can't put in a 6-digit code from its phone. So we've got a whole other set of problems around how do we manage those things, how do we provision them, and it's a new emerging piece of the bigger identity picture as well.
Yeah. I mean, we could jump into that right now if you wanted. How do you handle all of the proliferating machine IDs and non-human IDs and, like you said, APIs constantly needing to authenticate with each other and, both inside and outside an organization? That's like a whole other headache. I mean, it's a headache if you ask me, but it might not be.
No, I mean, I think from my perspective, when you're talking about human identities versus machine identities, to me, the kind of the challenges that we started out with, I don't think that, one has maybe a slightly greater risk than the other, right? So, but again, if you go back to the fact that if an application doesn't support modern protocols, it just becomes extremely difficult to manage, whether it's human or non-human, at any scale difficult. We found that in our research that we did with the Ponemon Institute, that 63% of the time, because there's such a scale problem and so many of these identities are managed just not in a centralized way, 63% of the time it's being managed out at the business unit level. And that could be okay. But if you think about it, a lot of times business units may not be the most well-versed in security best practices, right?
Right.
And then they're also doing all this work manually. And Neil's right, like automation has been a big part of things we've talked about over the last, 5-10 years with the cloud. But a lot of times that automation has been limited to like the, infrastructure as code, like how we build a cloud environment. When you get to like the granular level of how we're doing identity and access management, we're not quite there yet. So one of the other pieces we looked at was like the cost of this. And they found that on average, like when a new employee comes into an organization, how we were looking at like just how many people are involved generally, right? Roughly, it's about 8 people. And if we did some, numbers here, but like, so if you figure an average kind of staff salary, 81,000 a year, that's like almost 650K a year in a total annual staffing costs. And it just kind of highlights like some of those manual work inefficiencies around this. So Neil, I'm curious from your perspective, again, I love the fact that you were at Microsoft for so long. You kind of saw the full evolution of this, right? From his original note that he wrote on trusted computing back. When was that? Was that early 2000s?
That was 2002.
2002.
Right.
So you got to see kind of the whole evolution.
Yeah. Yep. From a non-human identity perspective in particular, but I think in general, once again, I started with cloud computing these days, and it is incredibly complex. Like I knew how to secure file systems in Windows, or how to secure Active Directory, and how to sort of manage identity there. It gets more complex the larger you get, but it's a fairly finite set of things. In the cloud, because we've got permissions for literally like every sort of service and every sort of action within every service, it just continues to proliferate, and it becomes exponentially more complex. And so, one of the things that's happened there is if we're manually managing those permissions, in particular for machine identities, whatever we want to call them, it becomes like there's no way to not over provision things, because you're looking at 800 different permissions thinking, well, what do I need to give this service account? And you're like, I don't know. I'm going to keep clicking things until it works.
Exactly.
And I mean, quite frankly, like I've been there, right? Like I'm thankfully not developing anything for production, but I've been through that and building out sort of demos like, okay, I did this. I'm getting permission failures. I'm going and reading through all of this AWS documentation. I don't know. I'm just going to click here and now it works. And that's okay for today, right? Like Matt, I think Matt's suggesting, I'm putting words in his mouth, but like Matt, I think one of the things that's really critical here is not just visibility into what your identity looks like and what your access looks like, but automation to be able to say, hey, sorry, I'm talking and my laptop just locked itself. So hopefully you can still hear me. It sounds
We can
like
still hear you and see you.
But
smooth.
That aside, apparently I need to hit a key every once in a while and not just talk. Okay. Anyway,
right?
Sorry.
It's authenticating you.
Yeah, I think
you are who you are, Neil.
Yeah, I am who I am. I know at least what I need to log into my laptop. But I think automation becomes a key piece of this, and really being able to say, hey, this application uses these 5 permissions. That's the limit of what it needs. And being able to do that at scale across hundreds and thousands of applications, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of accounts, being able to lock down, maybe start being over provisioned, over permissioned, and then figure out what's really needed based on what happens. I think that becomes an incredibly powerful tool that's starting to shape up. I don't think it's there everywhere. I know it's something that we do, but it's an evolving field to be able to say, here's what these applications, here's what these people actually need, and tighten it down and reduce that attack surface around identity.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think we're going to touch on this a little bit later. This is, I think, an area where AI is going to help, right? And we've talked about machine learning and AI for the last 5 years, pretty much. It got really hot last six months. But I do think this is an area that AI is likely to play a really good part in. In the past, there's been a lot of different products that have said they use, AI, ML for this kind of stuff. And it was really just like static rule sets that were looking for certain, like a pattern and then, flagging it. And it wasn't taking in all different kind of data sets. So I do think that's where AI is going to play a big role, and not just in the identification, but if you think about today, like how a SOC works, there's still, unless it's one of the most efficient SOCs, it's still very heavy on the human component, right? It's very labor intensive, and I do think that's one of the areas when we come to identity and access management, like Neil mentioned, when you look at the combination of human and non-human identities. I mean, depending upon the size of an organization, even if it's at a startup, right? Orca's a much larger startup than we are here at Serbi. But, if you look at even a company like ours, I am sure that we probably have thousands, right? And so if you look at a multinational, like a bank, right? They probably have millions. And when you think about that scale, our human minds, no matter how intelligent we are, we can't factor out those types of things and understand it. So that is an area that I think that AI, maybe not today, but I think very soon, probably 6 to 12 months, we're likely to see some truly improvements that are just beyond what may show up in a marketing glossy.
Yeah. And I like the way you express that. Like I'm, as far as technologists go, I'm remarkably cautious about AI.
Yeah.
I'm not on board with it's going to solve all problems everywhere. I think it's important to understand what problems it's good at. And this is one of those problems where I think AI really excels, or is going to be able to excel at solving it, because it really is a problem that we can't get our minds around at that sort of scale that AI is really good at. I think it's one of the places I expect it to be, to really drive the state of the art forward.
Yeah. So let me push back on that a little bit, because I think the other side of that is with AI's ability. Look at deep fakes, for instance, right? So that's faking someone's identity and then using that to get around any protections that are put in place. So how do you counter that when the AI is working against you and it's really freaking hard to tell?
Go ahead, Neil. I want to hear Neil's response.
So I think back, there's a great XKCD cartoon that showed how people think compromises happen, and it was two guys hacking and all this deep math, and then it was how compromises really occur, and it's a guy with a hammer saying, "Give me your password, or I'm going to hit you in the head." And I may be slightly misrepresenting it, but close enough.
Yes.
Fair point.
A lot of this stuff, like, once again, we have to think about where AI is good for attackers. And I don't think deep fakes is a whole sort of different problem, right? It's much more a political and social problem around what do we believe and what don't we believe in communications. I think AI there are some other interesting things here, like, can I use an AI to go map out your social graph and figure out what words you might use in a password? Like, that's something I would be concerned about if I think about the problem, right?
Right.
And the answers for me, defending against these things is no different than defending against all the other sorts of approaches attackers already use, whether they're using a hammer or they're using AI. I've got to be worried about, are my users using passwords that are guessable or crackable or in some way vulnerable? And how do I approach that threat, right? Two-factor auth, sort of the new forms of passwordless identity. Maybe context-based, like if I'm logging in from my home on the VPN, that's one thing. But if I'm logging in from a Starbucks in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, and I'm not normally in Saudi Arabia, that's a completely different sort of thing. I don't think the solutions today are necessarily that different for an attacker using AI for something. I think it's maybe speeding up and exacerbating problems, but it's not yet completely new categories of problems.
Yeah. I mean, I think And this is obviously this is related to the identity component, but I know sometime in the last couple of weeks there was a news article about people being able to basically create any not just a deep fake, but just from a voice perspective, somebody was able to defeat like voice-based authentication, right? So if you think about it, you know, I know there's a lot of banks that have that option, and it was, you know, a couple of years ago seen as a like a convenience, right? You basically call in from your number, they caller ID you, not that that can never be spoofed, right? They caller ID you, that's one piece, and then they would listen to your voice based upon your voice prompt, and they would let you in. We now know that that's probably not a good approach anymore. That can be very easily defeated. So yes, AI can definitely be used for those types of things. But again, one of the most fundamental concepts in cybersecurity still remains like defense in depth, right? Like you shouldn't be residing on or depending upon just one thing. So I think AI certainly is being leveraged by attackers, mostly for like phishing campaigns and being able to generate those with speed, and so it doesn't sound like the the prince from so and so asking you for some insane amount of money, right? I think we're beyond that now.
Yeah.
But I think that the advances for the defenders falls really into the areas of like anomaly detection, automated access decisions, predictive analysis, and efficiency, right? So we talked a little bit about the automation component, but when you think about things like access certification, password resets, things like that, just freeing up IT teams to be able to focus on more strategic initiatives, like those things, I think are very near term, and we're starting to see the beginning of those.
And I think anomaly detection in identity is going to be a big field as we move forward. Once again, it's where humans can't keep up necessarily, but an AI-like approach, that's exactly what it's built to do. Build a model of what the behavior looks like, and then start telling me where it's not inside that model. That's something, if we look at sort of common incidents where identity is a factor, like ransomware has oddly become the gold standard, if you will, of incidents to talk about. Typical ransomware incidents today are not a single machine, a single asset. They're a multi-stage compromise where some identity is compromised and then used to distribute and encrypt across a large number of machines. And there's a real chance in there to identify that anomaly early, that, hey, Matt normally works on these three things and does these three things, and today he's connecting to 50,000 assets and doing something else. Like you can detect that early and respond early across, I think, lots of different sorts of problems. And doing that well is gonna cut down on the ability of an attacker to move quickly and be damaging.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Neil, but I think that the challenge is, if you look at a lot of different IAM solutions that are out there today, be they in the cloud, on-prem, it's really agnostic to where it is. Some of the challenges, and I think I talked about this a little earlier, is that the IAM solutions that are out there often do a good job for applications that support those identity standards, the SAMLs, the SCIMs, the OIDC. Yeah. But what about all those applications in the enterprise across SaaS, on-prem, legacy, OT that don't support those types of standards? Typically, they're left out and they're thrown to some kind of exception bucket, right? In that same research that we did earlier this year with the Ponemon Institute, we found that most organizations, on average, have around 85 or more of these non-federated, non-standard applications, right? And that's average, right? So there's organizations that have well over 1,000, and maybe if it's a startup, maybe you've got a dozen or so. But organizations have a lot, and then if we drill into the organizations that have it, we ask the question: have you experienced a security incident specifically from these non-standard applications? And guess what? Over half, 52%, said they've experienced at least one, and 63% went even further and said they've had 5 or more. So we know that these applications are generating anywhere from, I think it's 10 to 15% of all breaches. And most people a lot of people assume, if they haven't studied the problem set, that it's like, oh, well, that's only like this very small percentage of like legacy on-prem systems. But that's not true. It's actually much much wider. And a lot of times, one of the other things we looked at in the research was we found a misalignment between the on the ground IAM practitioners and security leadership. Go figure, right? But what we found specifically was that 44% of IAM practitioners said that leadership specifically underestimates this risk. So it just kind of highlights it again, like if you're down in the weeds, you're the one that's doing access management for your company, you're like probably really aware of this, but you might be struggling to either elevate this risk to a point where your leaders care about it and add budget for it.
And just, what struck me is I don't remember, 50 odd percent, 60 odd percent. Those are the numbers of security incidents they detected.
Exactly.
But the chances are good if you
They're
don't
aware
have
of.
good integration with your bigger identity systems, that there are lots of incidents you are also not aware of because you don't have good telemetry.
Yeah.
Yeah, the best breaches are the ones that most people don't realize until it ends up on the news. Those are typically the best ones. You don't typically detect those in advance, very, very rarely, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest parts is that it's not that most organizations have underinvested per se in IAM solutions. It's just that the ecosystem of applications is so diverse. And the number has exploded absolutely since COVID, but really just over the last 5 to 10 years that you really end up with, organizations they've typically made an investment in some kind of IDP, right? Okta, Azure AD. They're typically using some kind of privileged access management, maybe like a CyberArk or something like that. And then they have got IGA platforms. And so you've got this mix of 3-letter acronyms that are kind of out there for all these tools. They don't talk to each other, and they can only work with the apps that support the standards. That's, to me, what really kind of leads to part of what's leading to this, again, the reemergence of identity as the new perimeter. Like, hey, we need to get back to investing, optimizing, and really looking at this because it really is, it is the front door. It's always been the front door, but I think people, the statistics from Verizon maybe are starting to seep in after all these years of reporting, like not, human error over and over and over.
Yeah. So how does just-in-time access, privilege management, least privilege, how does that help bolster your IAM perimeter? I just lost the word. Are these things helping? Are they making it too complex? Is it really just adding layers of pain in the butt that people don't want to deal with? Like what's the skinny on that?
And now I'm excited to hear Matt's answer.
Okay.
Well, I think like you mentioned just-in-time access, least privilege access, right? Like these are concepts that have been around for like a long time, right? A long time. I think I know we've got a pretty diverse audience on, but just like just-in-time access, right? You're trying to grant access rights only when it's needed for supposedly for a limited duration. Supposed to reduce the attack surface by minimizing the window of opportunity that someone could have unauthorized access or misuse it, right? So that's JIT, just in time. Then least privilege, which I know we're going to talk about zero trust later. Least privilege is definitely a big part of zero trust, another big topic. So get ready for that. We'll cover that later. But that's really making sure or attempting to make sure, and I kind of laugh at this a little bit, snickering when Neil was talking a little earlier about, when a developer or anybody's trying to figure out permissions the first time, they usually don't start off with least privilege. Usually it's like, I need to get this to work. Like the end of the sprint's coming up and the next, it's like Friday and today's like Wednesday. Something's not working. I'm just going to give it administrator or some kind of high privilege, and I'll tune it back later after it gets to, past sandbox environment. That doesn't usually happen. Right. So, I mean, I think to answer your question, they're both principles that are aimed at reducing the attack surface. But I think many organizations, again, struggle with these concepts because of, again, the scope and scale and the number of machine and human identities. It just becomes really difficult, especially, and I think the industries that perhaps have invested the most in this, like financial services, healthcare. They've got, usually these companies have like massive IAM programs. It's still a mess, right? You've got all these different tools. A lot of times the apps don't speak the right standards. It ends up being a mess. So I think they're both good. They're all very, very good components of a kind of a IAM 101 program, but organizations struggle to implement it because a lot of the work's being done manually, and oftentimes the applications don't support the standards that the tools they've invested in need to be able to carry out their automation.
And that feels really real to me. I was just thinking one of the most damaging security incidents I ever investigated. One of the root causes of it was it was on-prem Microsoft. They had a service account that was in the domain admins group, and this was clearly something that had happened because somebody was trying to troubleshoot something. It wasn't working. Somebody added the service account to domain admins. It started working. And nobody ever went back and figured out sort of the delta between that. And then what happened snowballed. So more sort of people got the credentials for this particular service account. So it was at a place where they didn't really even know everywhere in the enterprise this service account was being used. And they didn't know what would happen if they changed the password on it. Like they didn't know what they would break. And that's sort of an identity tech debt. And it was incredibly destructive in the end. So yeah, I look at like just in time for me is a magnificent thing if you can implement it. Least privilege is much more diffuse. It's a much bigger project, if you will, I think. But to me, very few orgs can solve those things everywhere. I think in general in security problems, security people tend to be absolutists. Like I can't tell you how many conversations I've had in
That's so true.
Last however many ever years that you suggest some improvement and people go, well, yeah, what about if I did this, 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 and this? It's endemic to security professionals, and I think probably to technical people in general. The reality is, if you can improve your security, everything is defense in depth. If you can improve your security today, you're in a better position than you were yesterday. You're not going to solve all of your problems, but you can solve some problems. And so for me, the net of this is I don't necessarily have to do just in time everywhere, as an example, right? Maybe I focus on the highest risk sorts of things. Like if I'm in an on-prem environment, maybe I focus on zero admin Active Directory, where there's Laura Robinson blew my mind when she first proposed that. That I am, that there are no Active Directory admins on a particular day, that I have to submit a ticket, go through whatever the process is to get AD privileges, to do what I need to do, and then check those credentials back in. That doesn't solve all of my identity problems. But if I can do that today or in 6 months or sort of whatever the project timeline is, I'm in better shape than I was before that. And then I can continue to build on that. So I think they're principles. I think focus on them where your threat model tells you they're important, sort of where you can make a difference, where you're doing greenfield work, and thus you can start you can get it right to begin with and sort of build from there. But don't necessarily think that this is something you have to solve everywhere or solve nowhere.
Okay. So let's talk about zero trust. Since, we've just been talking about least privilege. How does zero trust fit into this equation?
And, I knew you were going to ask that, and it's been killing me not to bring up zero trust this far in.
All right.
We got 38 minutes without talking about zero trust.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. And this is another one, right? Like the term has a bad reputation because every marketing department has slapped it on everything.
Yes.
But for me, it's not a product. And even once again, I'm a vendor. I'm glad if you want to talk sometime about how we can help you implement your zero trust plan, I'm happy to do that. But it's not a single product that solves this. This is a philosophy and an approach. And I think it's incredibly important. So there's this saying, and I've repeated it over and over in my career, right? As an attacker, you only have to be right once. As a defender, you have to be right every time. Meaning that as an attacker, once I get a foothold, I can sort of build on that and typically get into the environment, compromise what I'm after. But I can pick any sort of way into the environment. If I find somebody I can fish, if I find a vulnerable machine, whatever else, I have my way in. As a defender, I have to protect all of those things. For me, what's really important and really, I don't know, I can't even think of the adjective. What I really want to tell people about zero trust is this flips that saying on its head. As you implement zero trust, you start building on a land where attackers have to be right for every step along the way of their compromise, and defenders have room to be wrong and recover from it. So I may lose a particular asset. I may lose somebody's email when their laptop is compromised, but I have an opportunity to detect that and stop an attacker from moving forward, and really be more resilient and do a better job of containing things. So to me, it's critical as we move forward that we build on top of those principles, that we start understanding what it means to build this out, and to build in that protection for defenders to flip it and allow them some space. Now, having said that, I'm going to go back to what I said before, right? I don't have to do it all at once. Instead of zero trust, I would sort of think about less trust as a starting point. Once again, not how do I solve all of this problem all at once, because it is a massive undertaking. If you look at sort of zero trust programs in mid to large size companies, it's not a 3-month project. It's not a 6-month project. Somebody I was talking to was talking about DoD's zero trust journey, and they're targeting 2027 as when they will be where they feel comfortable that they've implemented it, right? That's 4 years from now. You don't have to eat the whole elephant, so to speak. Start with pieces of it and build on it, but take this as a philosophy around how you manage identity, how you manage other systems, figure it out, and then focus on that and build it in piece by piece.
Yeah, I mean, identity is, when you look at zero trust, identity is one component. A zero trust architecture consumes identity as part of how you carry out, right? And it's generally accepted that there's basically 5 steps for creating a zero trust architecture. I'm not going to go through like in detail, but first is defining a protect surface. And most people are like, wait, do you mean like attack surface? It's like, no, that's one of the most critical differences with zero trust as compared to everything we've done in the past. Is zero trust talks about the protect surface. And what is that? It forces you to, as a practitioner, as a risk practitioner, as a business, to identify what are the assets, data, application assets, and services you're trying to protect. As Neil said, it's not, you don't just say, well, my entire organization is a protect surface. Doesn't work. It doesn't work like that, right? Because then you're back to just what you were trying to do before. But that's step 1, defining the protect surface. Step 2 in building zero trust is about mapping the transaction flows. You have to understand how the data, application assets, and services, or DAS elements, how they interact with each other. Step 3 is where you start to build that zero trust architecture. Unfortunately, most clients that I work with who want to do zero trust, they try to jump right to like step 3 and 4. They want to go and buy this tool from this vendor. I got zero trust. And then they want to try to, create the policies, which is step 4, monitor and maintain. So I think identity certainly is a key component of zero trust, but it's not the whole thing, right? So John Kindervag is the creator of zero trust. He created it back when he was an analyst at Forrester, actually a good number of years ago. He's one of our advisors here at Serby, and he's done a number of blogs specifically on this topic. If the listeners want to go there, you can go to serby.com, CERBY, serby.com, go to our blog. I think he published his 3rd or 4th in a 4th series just earlier this week. But bottom line is that, like, for me, zero trust and identity are like, it's like peanut butter and jelly. They go together really well, unless you're allergic to peanut butter. However, in most organizations, zero trust strategy is all those applications I talked about before that don't support standards, right? So without support for those identity standards, it becomes nearly impossible to include applications in a zero trust architecture, because you can't define the who, what, when, where can define, that can access these applications.
That's kind of an interesting point there in the comments talking about JIT and AI. And, an AI would come in and set up your working environment to the apps that you need, the access that you need, and then I would assume, I'm just extrapolating from this short comment, but how long you need it, where you're going to be, what happens if you deviate from that. I don't know, just sparked a little something in my brain there. So,
I mean, technically, that's how, if you think about in a ideal zero trust scenario, that is how it would work. Matt would start his, I'd start whenever I start work, 8 o'clock in the morning. Technically, I should start with no access, right? I should be able to, a big part of zero trust is this continuous verification. It's not just this one-time access where I put a username and password in and maybe, two-factor code, and then, okay, you're fully trusted. Like, no, it's like this continuous verification. But I think in a ideal mature zero state world, you do that. You supply that initial set of authentication credentials, and then it could be like, hey, this is what you need. And then as you're working on it, an ideal state, again, you're being given access as you need it. And then, in some future Orwellian state, you would automatically be deprovisioned at the end of the day. That's not typically how it works, but that is, again, the philosophy behind zero trust is, exactly the data, application, assets, and services that are in the protect surface. You're only concerned with the protect surface because there may be things in your environment that just aren't as important, and maybe you haven't gotten to them yet. That's why, as Neil said, DoD has got a multi-year journey towards zero trust, because I'm sure they're not starting with their low privilege systems. They're starting with the systems that have national secrets on them. Like, these are the things that are most important.
Another good question. Can someone elaborate with some examples on these more advanced identity standards to fully implement zero trust? So I assume this is going back to when Neil and Matt were talking about legacy systems not being able to integrate with the standards. So what are those standards, and how can you, I'm going to ask, how do you bring the legacy stuff up to meet those standards?
Yeah, I mean, the protocol specifically, if we're looking at what we're talking about today, identity and access management, there's a number of protocols there. So you've got typically SAML, you've got OIDC, which is a newer standard. You've got protocols like SCIM, and those are usually kind of the underlying standards that a lot of these different modern identity and access management tools assume all applications are going to support, so they can do the automated onboarding and offboarding of access, updating permissions, all the stuff we're talking about, like the being able to do just-in-time access, least privilege. In order to do that at scale, the applications need to support all of those standards, right? Otherwise, it's where a great number of applications are today. It's manual, right? You make this, a lot of times, if you're a big company, you're making 7-figure investment in these different identity and access management tools, from privilege access management to IGA platforms. It's usually 7-figure investment, and you can then only use it for a certain percentage of your environment. So you're not really getting the best ROI. So to answer their question, those are kind of some of the examples. I don't want to list specific applications, but there's an interesting way you can very quickly see if you go to oinexport.com. OIN stands for the Okta Integration Network. Some engineer created this. It's an excerpt from basically all the apps that Okta supports out of the box. You can go to OIN Export, and you can see all the applications and what standards they support or they don't. If you want to see some examples, you can go out there and see exactly what those applications are. It's not every app, but it's a couple thousand that are in there. And you need that. It's not that if you have an application that doesn't support it, you can't do zero trust. It's just that it makes it really difficult when you look at that. I believe it's the 4th step of the zero trust architecture. Step 4 is creating a zero trust policy. You can't define the who, what, when, where. Neil should be able to access this application from this asset. If you want to get specific, from this time. You can't do that because his identity is not being stored in a central location, right? It's held in the application itself. That hopefully participant 722, hopefully that answers your, answers your question. Neil, if you want to add some.
Yeah, Matt, I just wanted to take a step back from it. Like one of the things, all of these identity standards or protocols, all of it, what philosophically ties it together, one of the big changes from what came before it is separating out auth-n and auth-c, separating out authentication, who am I, with authorization, what am I allowed to do? And so the idea here is that let's say my company is going to own my identity. So whether they're using Okta, they're using Azure AD, which we will all call Entra available eventually.
Right. Forgot about that.
Or, sort of whatever that is. Google, sort of whoever owns our identity. Every time you want to make sure that Neil is Neil, you will go to that identity provider, get back something that says, yes, this is Neil. And so that's all sort of managed. Do I have to enter a password? Do I have to use two-factor auth? Do I have to use particular types? Do I, sort of all of that proving I'm who I am is owned by the company. And then once you have my identity, the application says, okay, that's Neil. He's allowed to read this and write to this and do these things. And so that separating that out allows you to get that rich data back where you're controlling it about what did Neil do? Where did he connect from? What was he asking for? And get visibility into all of that and manage that identity. Whereas if you look at a legacy approach typically requires me to register on that application, provide a username, a password, maybe set up separate two-factor auth for it. And so now when I log in, there might be a log somewhere in that application, but there's nothing coming back to our central identity management to say, Neil connected, he connected from Brooklyn, from his MacBook that he uses all the time, and we made him do 2FA and he got it right, and then he went and accessed these things.
Yeah, I think I call that, so it's like dark signal. That's a cool word for that, right? Which is you have all this signal that's being typically generated, even if it's a legacy app. Most legacy apps, they have some kind of local audit logging that's happening. But that's that signal that could be, fed back into some kind of LLM. If we're talking about AI, it's just not part of the picture, right? So you've got, again, you're not feeding this back to your SIM. If you're trying to do anything fancy with AI, it's totally being held out in all these individual little islands. And the organization is not benefiting from those behavioral patterns, right? It's a big piece that's missing.
And even if you can somehow import all of those logs from all that 60% of applications that don't support your identity provider, you can't apply the same set of controls. You can't apply the same policies. You don't have a central point for all of that stuff to be applied and managed. And so it just becomes increasingly fractured and complicated to not just monitor, but manage.
Yeah. All right, folks. Well, we are. Oh, I'm
sorry, Sharon. You had one other question that I don't think we addressed, which was, what do we do with the legacy applications?
That is awesome. Can we wrap it up in 4 minutes?
Yeah, I think Matt already gave it away.
Okay.
Which is, first of all, you've got to start building this into purchasing decisions. You've got to say, we have an identity and access program. And if you're going to buy something, you have to fit it in. You have to support these standards, these approaches, or you have an exception process we're going to manage. I think there always has to be an exception process there. But the more that we put pressure on vendors to support these things, the more they're going to. Once again, I speak as somebody who has sold software for a living. Every time I lost a deal because of something we didn't support, I was going back to yell at product people.
Yeah, supply and demand.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. And then I think in the interim, because, I think a lot of people ask, well, isn't passwordless going to solve all this, right? Or passkeys going to solve all this, right? And the answer is that I think they're part of the equation, but there are just so many applications that are out there right now that are not going away for a very, very long time. So it's not going to be a 3-year, 5-year, it's not going to be a decade-long thing. They will take a percentage. And so organizations, I think, need to be looking at Are there solutions out there that can help them bridge between where they are now and their existing investments? And I think that's probably the best way to look at this, right? Yes, the pass keys and all that are something that can help us in the future, but we've got to secure what we have now. And there are options out there to kind of help branch between their existing investments and those legacy, non-federated, non-standard applications, which for some organizations, they're not even legacy. These are systems that they are using today, and they span IT, OT, cloud, and on-premise.
Yeah. All right. I am going to wrap it up here. Thank you so very much, gentlemen. This is, as always, an amazing conversation. Thank you to the audience for sending in such great questions. If we didn't get to you, we can pass them on to Matt and Neil, and they can follow up with you. But now I'm going to hand it back over to Cody, who will, I believe you have some gift cards to discuss.
I sure do. Thank you, Sharon. And Matt, Neil, thank you both so much for joining us back on Techstrong Learning. It's such a pleasure having you back on with us.
Thanks so much.
So I would like to remind everyone in attendance that we were recording today's session. So you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars, and it will be in the on-demand section. On to those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our winners are Stacy B, Unkit J, Ted K, and Karen F. So to our 4 winners, keep an eye on your email inbox to claim your gift card. It should make its way to you in the next 48 hours. If we don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder on the off case that it got filtered out. So awesome. Matt, Neil, looks like Matt already left. It was so great to have you guys here with us. Sharon, thank you so much for keeping this train on the tracks. And to our audience, thank you so much for being here as well. We really appreciate you spending time with us here at Techstrong Learning. And I do just ask for one more second of yours. If you stick around with us or click that link I just posted in the chat, that will take you to our post-webinar survey, and we would love to hear your feedback. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Sharon and Neil, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.